Nils.
Tilman.
Jonna.
Hello.
Jonna Häkkilä from, where are you from?
From University of Lapland, Finland. So over here at the Arctic Circle on top of the world. Previously, I've been working also in industry. So I have a bit over 10 years at Nokia, both at the business unit and then at the Nokia Research Center. And after that, at University of Oulu, and now in Lapland.
I hear every Finnish researcher has a history with Nokia.
Yes,
So.
yeah, that's true. So it feels like half of the country was working for Nokia in some point.
So you're pretty much an expert on, I don't know, mobile computing, but also on mobile HCI, right? So you combine these two strands with experience in industry, but also an enormous amount of experience in research. So what's your take
Hopefully.
on your take on mobile HCI or mobile UX? What makes that special?
Mobile HCI. So what makes it really special is that it's something. It's the next wave after the start of the computer and human-computer interaction research, which was originally very desktop oriented, and then we got these mobile phones and mobile computing, and suddenly the whole HCI and the whole how people interacted with the computers started to be not fixed to one location, but suddenly it was like everywhere. And mobile human-computer interaction is really a phenomenon which has like it has become the dominant way how people think of when using computing devices. So it's a fundamental paradigm shift from the desktops, from the fixed location to anywhere you go. And also it's a fundamental paradigm shift in not just using keyboards, mouse, but that you really have small screens and then touch screens. And now we are going even further in the mobile, like as the next step, like beyond the phones, where we talk about then wearable form factors, even integrating user interfaces to skin and so on.
You've been there when the iPhone came out, right? So you've been at Nokia, and I find this super interesting. I talk about that a lot with students. So before in 2008, I remember I had a Nokia N95, and I thought this is the best device I ever had. It was the best smartphone that exists. And then the iPhone came out, and my PhD advisor, she told me, "Hey, work on this. This is cool." And I was like, "No, that doesn't make any sense. I work on real phones and not on this iPhone stuff." So certainly I was wrong, and she was right. And what is the difference between these late Nokia phones and what came later? So what do you think happened at that time?
Yeah. So that was definitely an interesting time. And still, of course, it's easier now to look back at what happened. When you are living at that time, it's much more difficult to see like what is the direction the development is going to take, what's the direction what the users really want to take, and so on. So there's several things that happened at that time. So one was, of course, the technology side. So this fundamental change of going from hard keys, like physical keyboards, to the touchscreen. So that's one. And if you think of that change in the input modality, you realize that it's not just the input you are changing, it's the whole thing, how you use the user interface, how you design the graphical user interface, what it enables, what kind of functions, and the style. So that's one thing, the technology. Then another big shift was really this raising of user experience design. So previously, computing, like user interfaces and also like the whole computer science, so by its origin, it's very technology oriented. first you have to make the technology in order to get something to happen. But once the technology is mature enough, then you can start putting more attention to this user experience design. Like, how do things look like? How do you emotionally engage with your devices? What are the appealing factors for or values, everything you kind of what you can emotionally connect, or how you think of like aesthetics and so on. And suddenly the game in the mobile phones became much more also design dominated. So that's one. So definitely, like nobody can argue against that. The iPhone, like, it's a beautiful device and it's appealing, and this with the very strong branding behind, it's really a success story. Then also a third thing what happened at that time was that so basically we changed from the device-centered ecosystem to service-centered ecosystem, and having this possibility to access Apple services through your iPhone was one thing, that it's not just a device, but you have like a whole set of services behind. And also Apple managing to have the ecosystem there ready and with a good user experience.
One thing that I found really interesting in this shift, this paradigm shift, that it was so different. It was so aggressive in terms of forcing the user to adapt to a new way of interacting, right? So if we think back in the 80s, 90s, when Windows and Apple kind of like were pushing the graphical user interface, and we always use the metaphors of kind of like office environments, right? Like trash bins and folders and desktops to slowly transition the user from one platform into the next, right? These metaphors that we used in skeuomorphism. And then all of a sudden in 2008, Apple completely broke with that. They were like, no, we're just going to expect people to adjust with the way that we envision the interface. And so when people were looking for a trash bin, there was none anymore, right? And initially there were also no folders, although they did have some icons and desktop, but basically also this notion of kind of there's no keyboard anymore. Where do I type in my text, right? Especially challenge for BlackBerry users at the time. So what I found interesting, there was this cut with these old standing standards, and then not caring necessarily whether the user has a smooth transition into it, and just like throwing them into the cold water.
Yes, I think that kind of big decisions, they are very brave if you do them in the management level, and if you do them with the business, which it's such a big business and with so big money, that's a big risk. But definitely that's something that did the change and put whole track of the design and the development and the HCI for mobile devices on kind of like a new direction. Took a big leap.
From the very first iPhone, there were clear improvements. I think the very first iPhone had no App Store, it had no GPS, the camera was, I think, terrible. It only had Edge, I think, so no proper internet connection after all. But that improved very rapidly. But afterwards, like, what were the big innovations that came later after they had the App Store and stuff like that?
The genre of mobile phones as such, there actually hasn't been that big changes after that. So that was the time when where everything changed. And looking now back for the past 10 years or so, things have basically been very iterative. So there hasn't been that big paradigm changes or big changes even for the basic graphical user interface design. So that's also interesting to note. So now what are the next steps if thinking of mobile HCI and what has happened there? It's this that there's new form factors coming in. So it's not just about the smartphone anymore. It's more like it's also things that are wearable. Things are, for instance, smart watches, wrist-worn devices, and also these embedding sensors everywhere to your environment, to wearables, to accessories, and so on. So much has happened actually on the smartphone direction of the HCI, but on other things.
It's interesting that you mentioned wearables, because the phone itself, right? It morphed from a device that we would interact with to almost like a hub where other devices now connect to. So it replaced this central computing unit that we traditionally thought would be the desktop PC, and all of a sudden we have all these wearable gadgets using that platform and using the processing power available and also the connectivity, and it really morphed into this portable computer and hub that we can connect to.
Yes, I think it's really interesting, and it's like exactly this, that the phone is the gateway to different types of smart applications, Internet of Things, and so on.
As you said, the phone itself didn't really change a lot in the last, I don't know, decade. So that makes me wonder, is the iPhone the new N95, or is Apple the new Nokia? So there wasn't that much innovation anymore. I mean, they tried, they improved their device, but then it didn't really change anymore. So will we see some disruption soon? Something completely radically new, or is that it?
What we can say of certain that it's not, that's it, because things develop anyway, but it's really difficult to predict the future accurately. So if you could accurately predict what would be the next big thing, you would be a billionaire in it already. So of course there are these emerging technologies. So like, for instance, wearables on healthcare, sports, wellness. And then of course, virtual reality is something which is really taking off during the past few years as a consumer products and for gaming and everything. But what would be like if something comes like fundamentally to change the world and how we interact with the computing? It's hard to say what would be the winning thing, or if there's like a sudden paradigm change for something. So there's many promising directions, and probably we see them, like combinations of them, of course, in the future. But what would you put your money on to change the whole world? It's hard to say like what comes next as a.
Well, I think that the phone is similar to cars. So for cars, we didn't see that much innovation for, I mean, almost 100 years. So you can today take a car from 50 years ago and go on the Autobahn, and that's fine. No one would think you're crazy. You can't do that with computers. No, I think from 50 years ago, that's a car from the 70s. That's fine, right? You can do that. It will drive on the Autobahn. It will be perfectly fine. You can't do that with phones now, but you can take an iPhone from 10 years ago. That would be then from 2010. And you can still use it. Maybe it's not the nicest device, but it's still usable. And I think we will have phones for quite a while.
Yeah, it's kind of like a proven form factor that it works for very many things. And also this, that it's sort of like a very good compromise. Like, you still have a fairly big screen and what you can operate. If you compare, for instance, a watch, which is like really limited in space, just for the human ergonomics, like how big fingers you have and so on. But so it's proven, it has been proven that it's a pretty good compromise for a form factor. You can do a lot of things. It's like flexible enough, and still it's like very personal. You can carry it around.
You mentioned what the iPhone did better than previous phones, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Like looking at input, looking at output, looking at usability. And I think if we look at the next form factor, I think it has to improve in these aspects. So it has to provide a higher input bandwidth, a higher output bandwidth, and probably higher usability. And that's why I don't believe in wearables, because I mean, they don't provide a higher input bandwidth, they don't provide a higher output bandwidth, and then at least for current devices, they provide much lower usability. So it's an addition to phones, that's fine, but I don't think as a main computing device, it will not replace a phone.
What they replace is kind of this static notion of the phone is my computing device and that's it, right? So we've seen a lot of sensors being put in the phone, like accelerometer, GPS, gyroscope, and so on. And with the wearables, we now have access also to things like heart rate and a lot of other things. And so I think the question is not so much, let me just get this out of your face here. I don't want to quit Zoom, sorry. Sorry. And the phone itself, right, being this gateway, as Jonna said, becomes much more a companion that is aware of our surroundings and therefore knows how to, cater the services and applications more directly to us and into our current context. So in that sense, I think that there has been quite some developments and revolutions almost, right? Because we can sense so many things now with this, rather than just display one type of app or one type of website. We can really individualize or customize the experience based on where people are, whether they're in a social setting, whether they're outdoors, whether they're on a run, and so on. And I think that's quite revolutionary.
And if we think about context awareness, like over there, you can really see the like what's the influence on having all this technical development on the background that's going on. So recognizing context and processing all kind of like sensor data, it's like so much faster now than what it was like 15 years ago, for instance. So all this machine learning and other things where you get the data to the user interface, like and for instance, like how to adapt the behavior of the device and what kind of things to offer. It's just so much more powerful now what you can do in the background than what it was like 15 years ago or even 20 years ago. So that has enabled these new services, also like improved quality in the services, and things like if you try to do something like adaptive user interfaces, you don't want to get it wrong. You don't want to have the device behave so that the user feels that it's out of control, or you don't want the device to behave so that it makes embarrassing mistakes. This affected the social acceptability of the device use, and that's gone a lot ahead.
Well, where do we see that? I mean, we probably see that in things like keyboards, the current text entry mechanism. I mean, they are fueled by data and data-driven approaches. But adaptability, we don't really have that, right? So we still haven't solved that. We still don't know how to adapt the interface, maybe dynamically to the user.
What we have also learned during the years is also like, don't try that. So some things have been like proven wrong, like this is not a good approach. And that's also something of what research can do and must do, is to say that, okay, we tried that and we can say that it's not a good idea. So there's it's not just the value that you can create something new. It's also, there's also value in saying like, okay, don't do that. So I think these kind of things have improved. Like for instance, this research, there's been like years and years on the research, like, okay, when should my phone ring and when not? Then after all, it's basically like realized that it's best to give the choice to the user. And so I think that's like a good example, because that's like an age old, the problem is like as old as the mobile phone, basically. How we silent the phone.
We had this phase when there was, I think, Jamba, or I don't know how it was called in Germany, but these services where you could buy ringtones and everyone had ringtones on their phone. And there was this phase. And nowadays, we don't have ringtones. I think most people have their phones permanently silent, and phones just don't ring anymore. So that's an interesting thing. So we went through these phases where we are like, oh yeah, we have to provide very interesting ringtones over, yeah, how can we automatically adapt the volume to the user's needs, to just shut it off. No one likes it.
Although there's a lot of research on that, right? When to silence your phone and whether we can do that automatically. But I think, the adaptation aspect, actually, there are some very simple ways that have found its way into our everyday applications. So if you think about just the screen rotation feature, right? Based on the acceleration and then the gyroscope, when your interface completely flips, and you can design for that as a designer for landscape and portrait mode differently. I had an interesting malfunction adaptation, I would say, recently with the Zoom application now being constantly, in use. I figured, hey, I might as well take my meeting from a stand-up paddleboard. And as I was doing so, the phone actually switched itself into safe driving mode. And so when during the meeting I was called upon on speaking, I couldn't find the unmute button. And so I had to go back to shore and convince the phone that I was no longer in safe driving mode in order to operate the interface again.
Yeah, but that's a really interesting example. So that's like basically the phone or the device trying to outsmart you, kind of. And then you feel really stupid and annoyed.
I think that happens a lot with first generation context aware systems, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly that kind of examples. But I think your example is a little bit like it's maybe an extreme case. So no wonder that the designer didn't think of it. Huh?
How can you not?
What works is if you go to a website with your Android phone and the website isn't optimized for mobile use, then Google suggests that you switch to this mobile optimized perspective. And that works very well, for me at least. There's all this accessibility work. I think the iPhone really shines for these things. So if you have accessibility needs, you can actually adapt the interface to your needs. Often we just don't see that, I think. So I think we progressed, in fact, even for adaptability. But I think you're right. So if it goes wrong, this isn't an option.
That's why it's really important to put effort to user testing and user research. And really, I'm very much in favor of in the wild user studies. So basically really looking at the context where people would actually use the device in real life. Like for instance, if that would have been like if somebody would have run a 2-week user study with how Tillman uses the phone, probably would have come up with the surfing context. And so I think these in the wild user studies are really important, and they give perspective, something like what the designer doesn't think of at all in the office.
You do a lot of in the wild studies, right? Do you have any examples where you found something in one of your studies where you didn't necessarily think of as a designer when you were constructing the app?
Yeah, yes, actually I have a few examples on that direction. So there's different kind of findings what you can find, but for instance, just quite recently we were doing research on this sensitive context for design, graveyards. Graveyards are like cemeteries where they have the graves and tombstones and so on. So what we wanted to look at and to do research about is basically about how to design technology for such a sensitive context, because graveyards have like a, there's like a special atmosphere there, and there's like a lot of like ritual background, cultural heritage background in there, and also there's social norms how you are supposed to behave. But then on the other hand, it's very interesting, for instance, for the cultural history point of view, and also for this like a cross-generation design, like, like being aware of your heritage or learn more. So we created this demo application, Graveyard Navigator. So, and it was also inspired by this practical problem, like when you go to a graveyard, and they are typically like, they can be big places, and how do you find the grave you want to visit? So we did this prototype application, and we then ran user study where we interviewed people in the graveyard, and also like studied the user tested the application there, and then interviewed people with different kind of like probes there. And one interesting thing which we didn't expect when planning the study was that actually the people who were on the graveyard would be really interested in. So it's not just the visit we were thinking when designing the study, but then the like people who like dig the graves and so on, and they were saying like, hey, this looks absolutely great. Like we get interruptions like 20 times a day when somebody comes to ask like, where can I find this place, or where can I find this grave? Yeah. So it was like a different user group who were like really excited about the application.
Interesting. Yeah. They were probably like coming up with solutions themselves, like in the future, putting a Bluetooth beacon with everyone in the sarcophagus.
We didn't hear that.
Where you find them, yeah, relocate them.
That was not suggested, but that's certainly it was very interesting study.
That's a great example. Where you found a new stakeholder who actually profited from your app. Did you then take that feedback back and iterate on your solution somehow?
So the truth is that we are seeking funding for it now.
Okay.
So that's like so we want to continue and do iteration and so on. But then the reality of doing research is, of course, that you need to get it funded. Yeah. Basically, at the moment, the situation. But we have continued on this cultural heritage. So I do research on that, on mobile technologies, and also these more ubiquitous solutions and tangible user interface and so on. And then, yeah.
Yeah, and those iterations are quite fundamental to what we consider user-centered design process. Can you walk us maybe through an example from your research where you actually went through multiple iterations and how you gained those insights, especially from in the wild scenarios?
About the in the wild studies, where you can really really see the benefit and fun and the challenges of doing in the wild studies, was this exploration, what we did with the head-mounted displays and virtual reality, and taking it in the wild to the skiing, downhill skiing context. So,
wait, so you blindfolded people while going down the slopes?
Yeah, well, blindfolded people, that's basically my research group, because like, you hit the that's also a little bit risky area to do user studies. We just did it in the group. But yeah, so basically we wanted to try how would it be to take a HMD in the wild and in this completely new kind of context.
And rather than taking them on a walk, maybe you thought of, let's send them down over a hill.
Yeah, have to have some like, new ideas. And that was really something like what we really wanted to just explore. And we thought like, hey, nobody has done this before. Let's try it.
Probably because of ethics.
Yeah, or maybe because no one thought about it. I find skiing itself super scary, and then you put on an HMD. What did people see while wearing the HMD? So
basically there was we did motion tracking, and then what you saw is a virtual reality landscape of a downhill skiing. And as a finding, basically, I think the key finding was that, like with this virtual reality headset, at least already like that time, of course, there's this like the resolution is not that good, and it's an artificial environment, and it's like overall the user experience with the quality of HMDs is not that good. But if you are put into that kind of situation, you are too worried. Just like, you just worry about being alive, like how do you stay alive? And that these kind of like a little resolution problems, like nobody complained about that. And also it was quite interesting, this kind of like from the multimodal user interface point of view, that you start relying also to other senses, like, you know, to find the balance and hear the sounds and so on. So altogether it was really interesting. Yeah.
It probably shows that if you provide a nice experience or an interesting experience, then a lot of the technicalities don't matter anymore.
Oh, it's scary.
Yeah, if it's scary enough, you don't care
Yeah.
if the resolution is poor.
You just get the fight or flight reflex out of people, then your user interface may suck. And that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's, well, roughly put, but kind of to that direction. I think that's something interesting. But is
so
it,
an augmented reality version wouldn't have helped?
yeah, well, that's of course the next step. That, but of course that at that time it would have required significantly more implementation effort, for instance. So that was like now you have like substantially more choices in your equipment and technology. So that's also like something like when exploring new things, you have to sometimes make compromises what you can do and at what cost of an effort. Yeah, but of course that would be super interesting to continue now.
Looking at AR or VR in this case, that might be the future, right? I think that would be a disruption. If there would be a usable device, I could imagine that people would use that. And it would fit these things. It could improve at least output. So now I could have a much wider field of view compared to a phone.
First of all, like what are the acceptable use cases? Like kind of, then there's things such as, you have things like law, for instance, like are you able to record things in certain places and so on. And then there's this how comfortable people feel around you if you are wearing such technology, even if you wouldn't actively be using it, for instance, for recording. But if people think that, haha, he has this possibility or she has this possibility to use it, are people more cautious? And also what kind of things it could enable. For instance, we ran this really this kind of probes kind of user study a few years back about smart glasses, and where we just had a dummy and then asked people to put them on. We had like experience sampling for that, and then asked people to like imagine they put the dummy smart glasses on that spot where they were, and then they had to describe like what they would use it for over there and how does it make them feel. And for instance, there was use cases such as cheating while playing a cards game or playing chess and so on. So that's also something like it's not just necessarily privacy, but other things.
Well, maybe it's just because we haven't adopted the technology yet. I mean, if you imagine taking a phone from today and sending it back in time, I don't know, 50 years ago or 40 years ago, it would enable a lot of potential for, I don't know, cheating if you're in an exam, and probably no one would ever realize that. I mean, because people wouldn't be able to imagine that this is possible. So there might also been the possibility, but now we adopted it and then we adapted to it. So you cannot cheat with your phone anymore because we know that this is possible. Maybe something like that will also work out for AR devices.
Society adapts and people adapt their behavior according to like what kind of technologies come up, like with the cars coming or phones coming and so on. So certainly that will also happen with the whatever technologies will come in the future. But still, as a researchers and as a designer, we have to try for the best possible solution, and also point out that these are the risks. That's one role. So you can use research and do studies on like probing, like and pointing out like, hey, this is maybe not a good idea. There might be social acceptability problems with this solution.
Or if you now look back and look at how phones changed societies or mobile devices in general, that we now have very different behaviors compared to, I don't know, 20 years ago. When I meet someone in the city center, I typically we often don't say where we meet. We just say in the city center, and we give a time, but it's not a problem if you are 10 minutes late or half an hour late, because half an hour beforehand, you will text the other, oh, I will be there and there, and I will be late. And then the other one can respond with, oh, I will go to the cafe beforehand. And that's all fine now. But looking back 20 years ago, that wasn't fine, because if you aren't there at that very spot at that time, you're just extremely rude. So I think it became much more informal how we make appointments, because we now are connected to other people all the time. I think that's just one example. And I agree, it's important to think about these things, to consider, do we want to live in that society? What will this device change in our society?
That's a very positive example, right? Where the technology might have allowed people to do something they would naturally be inclined to do, such as, you know, being late, being less careful about the time management, the choice of, you know, a coffee location and such. But there are always also like unintended consequences, right? So in Melbourne, for example, we have at each pedestrian crossing in the city center, we have little lights baked into the floor that kind of like turn red on a pedestrian light. And the reason is because people like stare at their devices, right? So their heads down, they don't look at the light. And so at night, you have this entire plate like flashing at you when cars are coming. And so the, you know, kind of like the unintended consequences of phones being so engaging that we use them just all the time while walking and in our, you know, built environment. And so the built environment had then to adapt to that consequence, which I found really interesting. Or in general, I think Niels and we had a couple of conversations about how, you know, in HCI, we always, the best case scenario is we learn something about the user and then we improve the interface so that the user can more naturally or more effectively, with less errors and such, you know, get to their intended goal. But oftentimes it's actually the other way around, where we introduce a technology and the user has to somehow adapt to it. And I remember a couple of years ago when Pokémon GO came out, well, all of a sudden my battery was drained significantly in no time. And the app crashed my phone multiple times during one game session, but it didn't matter because the game was so exciting that I actually, you know, bothered with like restarting my phone all the time, or even got out and bought an additional battery pack to go and play. And so, yeah, adjusting the user behavior, like kind of like forcing them into a mode of behavior that they would probably not be naturally inclined to. But speaking of Pokemon Go, I hear you are an expert in Pokemon Go studies, Jonna.
So Pokemon Go, that was a big thing. Probably still is.
Still is. What was that about?
So actually, I can let Ashley Colley to talk about it.
Oh, second guest on the show, Ashley.
Hello. So I think for me, reflecting back on the Pokemon Go paper, the main thing there was it was a real global collaboration. So we had researchers, not just in Finland, but in US, Germany, Portugal, probably forgetting somewhere else. And it was really put together in a very short time, straight after Pokemon Go was launched. So I think that was the main achievement there, sort of global collaboration amongst research network.
What can we learn from it?
From the collaboration or the
Paper.
Paper, maybe.
Yeah, so I think there were really two parts to the paper. So the first was looking at this potential unfairness between different areas and different players. So because Pokemon Go, the original map was based on some older maps and so on, which had some bias in the sources that they were collected from. This then resulted in some unfairness that the players that lived in particular areas had less Pokemon to collect. So I think this was the main finding, that even in something that seems like a game, there's some potential unfairness there, which perhaps should be addressed.
Oh, look at you, empowerment for Pokemon players. I like it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's also something that's interesting, that even though we do research on technology, there can be a societal angle to it, and looking at also like other underlying phenomena, not just like how people use the technology, but also like what is it in the bigger picture of the society. So I think that's something what makes mobile technology is really interesting to research, because it's such a fundamentally embedded thing to our everyday life.
Nice. Thank you, Ashley. I stopped playing Pokemon Go after I ran with my bike straight into a bush.
Yeah, that's
One-handed playing and biking in a mobile setting was not a good idea. I might have been intoxicated too, but so it goes.
So what's the craziest stuff you're actually working on?
Yeah, well, I'm working on a lot with wearable computing at the moment, so aesthetics, from the aesthetics and design point of view, so together with clothing designers, for instance. Then I'm also working on using shadows as ambient information displays, so manipulating shadows. So you have an object and then you have a shadow, but the shadow is not real, but it's like artificial shadow, and then you embed some changes, dynamic changes to it, and then you see like it's very exploratory. So what are the possibilities? What's the acceptance? What are the good ideas and what are the bad ideas? What are the essential elements in the user experience of interacting with shadows?
Is that as an ambient output device, or is it necessarily ambient?
So currently that's like our viewpoint to it. So because shadows are a natural element, it's like you have them everywhere in the natural world, and you don't have to pay attention to that. But then suddenly, if you want to put some like unobtrusive information delivery, because I want to get rid of the screens or displays in the traditional sense and use more like natural elements. So it does have a potential. It does also create a little bit spooky feelings.
Yeah. I was gonna say, it sounds like straight out of a horror movie where my shadow like grows over me and then kind of like starts gulping and
There's a lot of possibilities. So we just recently run a study where we staged a cafeteria setting, and then we have different scenarios of having ghost shadows and different visualization of the shadows. Yeah.
You have an interesting choice of research project selection. I must say, you send skiers down a hill blindfolded. You send your participants to a graveyard, and then you manipulate their shadows. It's next generation HCI, I would say.
Yeah, well, you have to follow your heart, and plus, I really think that that's one of the biggest roles in HCI research, is to try to look what it could be in the future. Like, what is it there that is beyond of the existing world, what we live in now? Because technology is developing so fast, and there's a lot of things that are going to be possible in the future. And we should have a little bit, I think that we need to have a forward-looking view in HCI to articulate these visions and show that this is what it could be in 10 years or 20 years, and what do you think about it? And that way we can steer, like, or explore or make things visible.
Where do you get your ideas from for these projects?
From my head. I love science fiction also, and I think curious mindset. I think that's the essence. Isn't that for all researchers?
Hopefully. So I think that was a nice end. Be curious and
Be
think
curious.
beyond what we have.
Be curious and courageous, I guess, in your case as well.
So thanks a
Thank
lot, Jonna, for being with us.
Thank you, my pleasure.